So good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all of you joining from around the world. My name is Tang from Hong Kong UST Institute for Financial Research, and I'm also a research fellow at Luohan Academy. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar hosted by Luohan Academy, where we explore cutting-edge academic insights at the intersection of finance, technology, and society. So today we're delighted to have Professor Anthony Lee Zhang from University of Chicago Booth School of Business to present his latest research on competition in the cryptocurrency exchange market. So Professor Zhang's work spans like household finance, industrial organization, real estate, and decentralized finance. He is the recipient of several prestigious awards, including the EQR Top Finance Graduate Award and the Facebook Fellowship. In today's talk, Professor Zhang will introduce a novel theoretical and empirical framework that helps us understand why crypto exchanges are so fragmented despite trading the same set of assets. The paper sheds light on the role of arbitrageurs as a glue across fragmented markets and introduces the concept of star-shaped equilibrium, where central exchanges like Binance and Coinbase function as liquidity hubs that coordinate market activity across smaller exchanges. With that, let me now hand the floor over to Professor Zhang. So Anthony, the screen is yours. So you can try to share your screen.
Great. Is this working?
Yeah.
Great. So thanks very much. I'm very happy to have the chance to present here. So I'm presenting this paper, and it's co-authored with Hu Junyi, who is also in the audience. So Junyi is currently a master's student at Columbia, and then he was an undergrad at Fudan when this project started, and he's heading to USC for a PhD program in the fall. So as you can see, my co-author is very talented. And then if you see anything good about this paper, it's probably because of him. If you see any mistakes in the paper, that's probably my fault. Okay, so then this paper is about competition in the market for crypto exchanges. Suppose you want to buy some crypto asset like Bitcoin or Ethereum. So ignoring whether or not this is a good financial decision, how would you do that? What you would do basically is you would go to a crypto exchange. So you can go to an exchange like Binance, right? And how does Binance work? Binance, you take your bank account and then you send some currency, fiat currency from your bank account to Binance's bank account. And then Binance holds that for you. And then you're allowed to trade with Binance, with other people who have assets on Binance, your custodied fiat currency for their custodied crypto. So you can trade Bitcoin, you can trade Ethereum, you can trade other assets, right? So you could do that on Binance. You could also do that on Coinbase if you're in the US, right? You can send Coinbase fiat, and you can use that to buy crypto and so on and so forth. You can do that on Huobi. You can do that on Bybit. And if you think about the funny thing about this market is that there are a very large number of exchanges that allow you to do functionally the exact same thing of sending them money and using it to buy crypto, right? And this is very puzzling because if you look at the US stock market, there are a lot more assets and a lot fewer exchanges. So in the US stock market, there are essentially a few thousand stocks. And then there are maybe a dozen or a few dozen exchanges that allow you to trade them. The crypto market, in an asset sense, is extremely concentrated. There are basically 3 assets that are responsible for the vast majority of market cap in this space. But there are a very large number of exchanges, over 1,000 active exchanges in the world that allow you to trade cryptocurrencies for fiat. So the motivating question we start with is extremely simple. Why are there so many crypto exchanges? Why do you need so many different institutions to do fundamentally the same job? In particular, there's this classic idea in finance of liquidity begets liquidity. There's this classic idea that basically if people trade, they tend to want to trade on one large exchange because there's more liquidity. And so the question is, if the exchanges are basically offering the same service of trading fiat for crypto, why don't the bigger exchanges just absorb the smaller ones or outcompete the smaller ones? Why doesn't everyone just converge to trading on one or a few exchanges? And you might say, well, fragmentation in this market is here because the market is young, because there's a lot of entrants and eventually this will shake out. So one simple hypothesis is basically that crypto exchange structure is fragmented because the crypto market is young. And if we just wait a little, this will converge to a much smaller number of exchanges in equilibrium, just like in classic markets, right? So this is the question of the paper. By the way, I'm happy to take questions during the talk. So I guess, how should we handle this? Is it just people unmute or raise hands if they have questions? How do you guys usually?
I think the people can audience can raise hand maybe or can unmute.
Great. Yeah, so I guess anyone just feel free to raise hand or post in chat or however you feel. But I'm happy to take questions during, so please ask questions as you have them. Okay. So in this paper, we're going to give a kind of interesting answer to this question. So here's the answer. Ignore crypto exchanges for a moment, and let's think about a very different market structure. Imagine you are 500 years ago, and then imagine you're thinking about the market for corn or wheat or some kind of agricultural commodity 500 years ago, right? So you're in some province of, say, China or Europe or something like that, and then we're thinking about the corn market. So a bunch of farmers are planting corn in different villages in, say, China, all right? And basically, liquidity effects suggest that it's efficient for the farmers to all go to one place to trade the corn, right? But if you think about it, this is logistically impossible because of the fact that the farmers are very far from each other. And then if you just have one exchange in one town, then this is very inefficient in terms of transportation costs. So then what happens is you have a different market structure where essentially you have a network of fragmented exchanges. So then what happens is that farmers in one village basically sell to buyers in that village. And so local supply and demand imbalances are worked out through sort of trade in these villages. And what happens is occasionally people in one place will plant too much corn, more than they need. People in another place will plant not enough corn. And then there are supply and demand imbalances across villages, right? And then so what happens is you have specialized arbitragers who work out the supply and demand imbalances across places, where essentially they buy from the places that have too much, they sell to the places that have too little, and then they make the market better, right? And then, so certain markets might emerge in this process as hubs of arbitrage activity. Chicago famously emerged as a kind of commodity trading hub in the Midwest, right? So in this network of fragmented exchanges market structure, we have villages, and each village has its local exchange. And supply and demand imbalances are worked out within villages for local trade and across villages for regional trade. It so happens that certain villages just endogenously emerge as the arbitrages that connect villages happen to form a structure where everyone, instead of trading among small villages in the US, trades through Chicago, right? And then so essentially what is going on here is that liquidity effects lead the market towards consolidating towards a single exchange. But transportation costs make this infeasible. And instead, the market naturally evolves towards a structure where there's a bunch of local exchanges connected through arbitrage that may arrange themselves into a star structure around certain trading hubs as hubs of arbitrage activity, right? So the core message of our paper is simple. The core message of our paper is that crypto exchange market structure looks less like market structure for stocks and bonds today, and more like market structure for commodities. This is an analogy for the structure of the crypto market today. So a simple question you might ask is the following. A simple question you might ask is, well, corn is a very primitive commodity, and corn has transportation costs. And then why does crypto face the same transportation costs as corn? If crypto is a modern financial asset that crosses boundaries, that has no transportation costs. And the key thing we're going to argue here is that crypto itself is totally fungible across countries and simple to transport across countries. Crypto itself does not have any natural transportation costs. Someone in Africa can send crypto to someone in the US just as quickly as they can send to someone. Geographical boundaries do not matter for crypto. However, the job of a crypto exchange is to link the unified cryptocurrency rails of the world to the fragmented fiat ecosystems of the world, the fiat and regulatory ecosystems. So what's going on basically is that in order to do this trade with Binance, to buy crypto on Binance, you have to send money to Binance's bank account. And the money you send differs depending on what jurisdiction you reside in. If you're in US, you want to trade US dollars for crypto. If you're in China, you want to trade Chinese currency. If you're in Australia, you need to trade Australian currency. And the problem is basically it's hard for one exchange to simultaneously accept fiat currencies in all the different fiat jurisdictions in the world. It's hard for one exchange. Exchanges are regulated, and it's hard for one exchange to simultaneously work with all the regulators in the world. So what happens is that fiat and regulatory boundaries, among other factors, create transportation costs just like the physical transportation costs we see in commodity markets. And the result of this fiat and regulatory boundaries is basically that crypto markets become fragmented. There are exchanges specializing in dealing with US customers and their fiat and regulatory issues, Australian customers, Chinese customers, so on and so forth. And arbitrageurs play the role of linking these markets together. So this is the core of our argument narratively. What are we going to do? This paper has a couple of parts. First of all, we're going to write down a model, and that model is going to describe the the international crypto market, but you could think of it also as a model of the international, of commodity markets sort of in the distant past, right? And then so essentially it's a simple model where we think about what happens when you have a bunch of local exchanges with captive customers that are imperfectly connected. And we essentially think about when we have arbitrages, deciding which exchanges to connect, what happens in equilibrium. What we're going to show is that it's possible for a star network to emerge in equilibrium. So the classic liquidity begets liquidity effect that people want to trade on the same exchange works not only for customers, but also for arbitrageurs. In a setting where exchanges are exogenously the same, endogenously, they can become differentiated and central exchanges can emerge through the actions of arbitrageurs. But there is one caveat, which is that this only happens under certain parameter settings. In such star network equilibria, however, what we show is that prices and arbitrage flows endogenously become concentrated, and then central exchange listings end up having a large influence on market outcomes. Then we're going to go to the data, and we're going to argue that this appears to describe what's happening in the data. So we're going to show basically that the data seems to suggest that exchanges have developed a core periphery market structure in practice. We're going to show that prices and arbitrage flows both show a core periphery pattern. The large exchanges in our study, Binance and Coinbase, appear central in the sense basically that prices and arbitrage flows are centered around these exchanges. We're going to show that some predictions about our model, about what central exchange listings do to price dispersion, trade and arbitrage volumes hold up in the data. So there's a question, is it because the crypto actions, cross-chain action is expensive and sometimes slow, which makes it similar to the commodity market? Actually, not quite. So the exchanges we're talking about here are centralized exchanges, right? So the job of a centralized exchange mostly is not in bridging multiple crypto chains, but in bridging fiat currencies to crypto, right? So in a sense, it's not that the cross-chain action is expensive and slow. It's simply that crypto settles quickly and banking can settle very slowly. And how banking settles and how you work with banking differs a lot across countries, right? And then so the entities we're going to look at in this setting are mostly those entities. If you think about it, fiat crypto exchange market structure is a lot more fragmented than, say, Uniswap, right? Like Uniswap is quite dominant on Ethereum. And then this makes sense in our theory, because if you don't have the fiat and regulatory boundaries on Ethereum, everyone is trading USDC for Ethereum. And then there's no point in having multiple exchanges more or less for this same thing. So essentially, I think our theory matches the stylized observation that DEXs are fairly concentrated and CEXs are somewhat less concentrated, right? So really like what we're talking about is this fiat crypto distinction rather than cross-chain cross-chain arbitrage in that sense. If anyone else has any questions, feel free.
Oh, yeah. I also have a question. So, so in the introduction, you mentioned that in the motivation, you mentioned that crypto has a lot more exchanges than equity exchanges. But your explanation, I agree with that. The friction of arbitrage across exchanges in the crypto market can potentially allow this decentralized market to exist. However, why does that make the crypto exchanges a lot more than the equity exchanges?
That's a very good question. I think that the core difference, in our view, between crypto and equity exchanges is, maybe I'll jump forwards to a couple differences, which I'll highlight, and then I'll also talk through what I think is the core driving difference. So first of all, I think the core driving difference is that the fiat and regulatory boundaries that exist for crypto don't exist for equities. So the reason is the following. A crypto asset is commodity-like in that a Bitcoin exists on the Bitcoin ledger, and a Bitcoin is fungible internationally to all owners of Bitcoin. And the problem with Bitcoin fiat trading is you have a difference of ledgers problem. That US fiat currency lives on US rails and is owned by US residents. Bitcoin lives on a different set of rails, right? So there are a lot of people in the world who want to hold Bitcoin, and not all of them have or can hold US dollars. Now, stocks are different because traditional financial assets are basically legal constructs. A US stock is basically a US legal fiction. And a US stock can be owned by US entities, just like US dollars can more or less be owned by US entities. So there's no difference of rails problem because to some approximation, US equities live on the same set of infrastructural rails as US dollars. And so as a result, everyone who wants to trade US equities can trade US dollars and can do that using a US bank account. You can assume in the construction of a US equity exchange that the dollars are in a US bank and the equities are at the DTCC, right? So essentially our explanation is that. And then similarly, like equity exchanges in other countries don't have this difference of rails problem because you can assume that everyone has one set of banks and then one set of like equities clearing. So essentially the difference of rails problems only emerges in the crypto setting, that crypto lives on the crypto rails and then dollars live on the dollar rails, right? And then sort of because people want to trade different fiat systems for crypto, you need different interfaces for different sets of fiat currencies. So I think that's a short answer. Does that kind of?
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And everyone, please keep the questions coming. Should trading safety be considered in the model? The commodity market doesn't have the wallet. I disagree with this. I think the commodity market does have the problem, which is that if you ship a boat of gold to like the US and like somebody steals your gold, like that's still an issue, right? So I think trading safety we don't directly deal with in the model, but I think you could say that there are somewhat related issues, which is that trading safety interacts with regulation and also interacts with basically preferences of customers, right? So essentially, regulators regulate what are the requirements for exchanges to guarantee custodial safety for their customers, right? So essentially, US regulators say exchanges have to follow one set of rules. European regulators say they have to follow another set of rules. And some of these rules are designed to protect customers from the risk that exchanges default, right? And so this makes it hard. This is one thing that makes it hard in our model for exchanges to operate in multiple places, right? Because you have to follow multiple different sets of rules. At some level, it's simpler for one exchange to satisfy each set of rules. Then you have a set of, then you can ask, why don't you have exchanges that just work outside any system of regulation? And I'd say the answer is those exchanges exist. They can't use fiat currencies because if you use fiat, you have to use bank transfers. And if you use bank transfers, the US can shut your bank account off if you don't follow the rules, right? And then the problem with unregulated exchanges is also that if you say set up a stablecoin exchange, right, then sort of if there's no government regulating the exchange and they're custodial, if they're holding Bitcoin and dollars for you, they can just run away with the dollars, right? So there definitely is that set of exchanges, but they end up banking customers who basically, there are trust issues that you have to trust that they won't just run away with the money. And basically sort of there end up being niches where sort of the regulated exchange niche and the slightly less regulated exchange niche. So while we don't directly deal with trading safety, I would say the core issue of custody and the regulation implied by custody that because Binance is holding Bitcoin and dollars for me, that becomes a financial regulation problem is one of the driving forces of why we have fragmentation in our model. Does that answer your? Thanks. Okay. And then, so what are the implications of our results? Essentially, we want to build a narrative for why it makes sense for the crypto market to look this way. And so we're pushing back against the point that we made in the previous slide and basically arguing this is not a temporary phenomenon. The core economics of the crypto market, the core of what crypto is as a financial asset explains why this market structure looks so different from traditional equity market structures. So this has some regulatory implications for how do we regulate exchanges, how do we regulate arbitrageurs, right? And it also has some predictive power, which if our story is true, it suggests that market structure may fluctuate over time. Market structure may become more concentrated, but there's some limit to how easy it is for crypto exchanges to consolidate that is driven fundamentally by these regulatory and fiat boundaries. So related literature, we feed into a couple literatures. Empirically, we feed into a literature on crypto exchanges and crypto price dispersion. So we build on a large literature now that basically documents that there seems to be differences in prices across crypto exchanges. And these differences in prices are too large to be explained by bid-ask spreads alone. We also fit into a literature analyzing flows on blockchains. And in terms of theory, we talk to, but differ a little from the literature on exchange competition. And then we also fit into a literature on market fragmentation and double auctions. And then I'll talk about the connections later. So I'm going to spend some time on the institutional background, then I'm going to talk about the model, and then I'm going to spend some time on data and results, and then conclude. So I've gone through this mostly. Crypto exchanges allow people to buy and sell fiat for crypto. You send money through a bank transfer, you trade it for crypto, you withdraw the crypto. And the funny thing about crypto, remember, is that you can do it the opposite way also, right? So when you buy stocks, more or less the only thing you do is you send money, you buy some stocks, and then you hold the stocks, right? For crypto, you can go the other way around also. And this is going to be important when talking about arbitrage. So I can send some Bitcoin into an exchange. I can sell the Bitcoin, and then I can withdraw the resultant US dollars into my bank account, right? So where would you get the Bitcoin? This will go into our discussion of arbitragers, where their job is to buy Bitcoin in one exchange, send it to another exchange, and sell for profit there. Why would you trade crypto? Not so important for our message. You might want to store value. You might want to avoid capital controls, inflation, things like that. Again, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but sort of practically on sort of why people are using these things. You might want to do DeFi. You might think Bitcoin prices are going up, right? Doesn't matter that much for the purposes of our talk. So an interesting aside, and why I think this is an interesting area to write papers in overall, is that the role of crypto exchanges is much larger than the role of exchanges for many traditional assets. Essentially, equity exchanges in the US operate as matching systems. They match buyers and sellers. They don't handle custody, they don't handle settlement, and they have very limited functions other than matching. Crypto exchanges have a much, much larger role. So crypto exchanges do custody. They handle the onboarding and offboarding of fiat into crypto. They're often vertically integrated. They do VC, they do applications, they do derivatives, they do leverage. So these are very interesting entities to study, because to the extent that the crypto world has universal banks, the exchange label is a bit of a misnomer. These guys are not just exchanges. These guys function something like the universal banks of the crypto world. So while not the topic of our talk, I think there's some degree to which these entities are understudied, given their very, very important and very vertically integrated role in the ecosystem. So I've talked a little about this. There are a lot of crypto exchanges, right? And there's basically a combination of a few large exchanges and then a long tail. So they mostly trade the same assets. So there's a long tail of assets, which is going to be important for our study. But it's also the case that the top 2 or 3 coins, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, and I believe possibly either Ripple or Solana or something, are responsible for over 50% of crypto market cap, right? In the talk so far, I have emphasized fiat and banking differentiation as a driver of differentiation. There are potentially others, right? So sort of exchanges could be differentiated in the products they offer. Some exchanges may be targeted towards advanced traders, offering derivatives, leverage, things like that. Some exchanges may be targeted towards more retail traders and perhaps charge higher spreads. If you go to the airport, occasionally when the market is doing well, you see giant billboards saying, oh, we start a new crypto exchange. So you could have differentiation due to advertising. For our paper, we're agnostic as to what the drivers of exchange differentiation are. And past empirical literature has documented that many of these things seem to be drivers of differentiation, right? Essentially, for our paper, though, we're going to just assume that some source of differentiation exists. It doesn't really matter for our paper's arguments. What is the main source of differentiation? So a few things about crypto exchanges versus equity exchanges. Essentially, sort of, while these literatures look similar, I think there's a core institutional difference between equity exchanges and crypto exchanges, which drives some differences in modeling. So in equity exchanges, consumers almost never interact with equity exchanges. You don't trade directly with or interact directly with the New York Stock Exchange. Instead, you go on a broker like Robinhood, right? And then Robinhood takes your order, and then Robinhood routes it either to an exchange or to Citadel or someone else. And then that eventually makes its way to the exchange. And why this is important is it means that you never interact directly with the exchange. And in particular, your broker is subject to regulation, such as Reg NMS, which basically says the broker is forced to give you the best price. So essentially, the way you should think of the US equity setting is that consumers are not sticky to exchanges. And exchanges are forced by regulation to compete to offer the best prices to consumers. Crypto exchanges are different. So there is less intermediation. a customer signs up and trades directly on the exchange. And there's no regulation in forced price competition on spreads. So a funny story is that I was buying some crypto on Coinbase recently. And then so I figured out basically that if you buy on Coinbase, Coinbase will charge you a mandated spread adjustment of something like 2%. And they're like, oh, that's designed to cover the bid-ask spread, right? On basically one of the most liquid assets in the world. And by the way, if you read the fine print, it basically says, oh, by the way, if the realized bid-ask spread is smaller than this, we keep the gap, right? So there's a button you can click that turns that off, and then you can basically just do a market order, right? And then they charge you roughly, I think, 1%. If you further figure out the buttons to press to submit a limit order, they charge you 0.5%, right? So essentially what I mean to illustrate with this example is that there's a large degree of fee price discrimination on crypto exchanges. And then that is, I think, suggestive of a fairly high degree of customer stickiness. They can do things that suggest basically that there's not enforced price competition across exchanges. And there's no simple way for a simple consumer to compare quotes across exchanges either. And so essentially, this is going to drive our modeling where we say basically crypto exchanges are more sticky than equity exchanges. We're going to build a model assuming stickiness and then assuming that that is going to create a commodity-like network of exchanges market structure. Okay, so let's get to the model. We're going to write a model which basically tries to figure out what happens with this kind of network of exchanges market structure. So a coin is going to be traded on exchanges with captive customer bases who have quadratic holding costs. Arbitrageurs can move inventory across exchanges, and arbitrageurs are also subject to costs. So we basically think of a two-stage game where arbitrageurs choose which exchanges to link, and then trade happens. And what we're going to show is that the classic liquidity begets liquidity effect can kick in, and we can have centralization in equilibrium. However, this doesn't always happen. And we're going to show what we think is a new trade-off that governs when this will happen. Star network equilibria are going to have implications for the structure of price correlations, arbitrage flows, and central exchange listings that we're going to test in the data. Okay, so we have n exchanges, and we're just going to exogenously say there's n, you can think of this as n little villages where people are trading corn, or n countries where people are trading crypto with fiat. Each has a measure 1 of captive customers and has the following, the captive customers have the following utility function. So Q is the net quantity you purchase of crypto. X is an inventory shock. So the inventory shock can be thought of as more or less like a demand shock. Essentially what happens is that some places get a negative X, causing you to want to buy Bitcoin. Some have a positive X, causing you to want to sell, right? So in the corn example, you can think of this literally as corn dropped on a village, right? So high X means the village has an unusually good harvest of corn, so they have too much and they kind of want to sell. And then X negative means they have not enough and then they want to buy, right? And then there's a quadratic cost term here, which implies that you have decreasing marginal utility, right? Psi is a constant value shifter. We can assume it's 0 for simplicity. So this is a very simple inventory sharing game, right? Because of the fact that all the exchanges have identical consumers and consumers have concave utility, the optimal solution, since everyone is identical, is to distribute the inventory evenly across exchanges, right? So we want Qi plus Xi to be equal for all the exchanges. And of course, the solution is the following. Given an amount of corn dropped on every exchange's head, what we should do is just add up and get the total corn, and then give 1 over n to it to each exchange. And then so the optimal solution in this problem is that your initial inventory plus the amount you trade is equal to 1 over n of the final inventory, right? And then we're going to show that we get partly towards this, but keep in mind that this is where we want to get, right? Consumer inverse demand in this system is very simple. It's just linear, right? So you differentiate this set to 0 and invert the marginal utility, and you get basically that my demand depends on the price minus this constant shifter term times the demand elasticity. So the important thing here is just that gamma measures how elastic consumer demand is, right? So if gamma is very high, then consumer demand is inelastic. If gamma is low, consumer demand is elastic. Now we're going to have arbitrages. And an arbitrager in stage 1 of the game picks 2 exchanges to link together, right? So essentially, we're going to make this a network problem by making arbitrageurs choose pairs of exchanges. Obviously unrealistic, but helps the model be tractable. The arbitrageur's profit function is the following. So Zij is the net amount that the arbitrager buys on exchange I and sells on exchange J. If I do that, my profit is the gap between exchange J and exchange I prices times the amount that I trade. So an important simplification we make to this model is that in our model, unlike the market makers in classic trading models, our arbitrageurs are only allowed to transport inventory. So they're not allowed to hold net positions. They don't absorb the asset at all. So this is obviously a simplification. As you'll see, this simplification is quite useful for solving the model. It leads to a fairly intuitive model in the end. And essentially what this does is it cleanly separates the role of transportation and the role of inventory holding. Arbitrageurs transport stuff, consumers end up holding stuff. All the stuff ends up held by consumers, right? Arbitrageurs have a cost of transport. So, let me talk about prices. So PJPI are the prices on exchanges I and J. These are going to be set in a simultaneous uniform price auctions between arbitrageurs and consumers. So a benefit of our model is our trading model is static. We're going to get a model of limits to arbitrage where price gaps are imperfectly arbitraged away. And it's a completely static model. And so this has a lot of benefits in terms of tractability. We're going to assume competitive bidding against to simplify. So you can relax this, but it becomes very messy. The final term in arbitrageurs preferences is this quadratic inventory cost term. So what happens is basically arbitrageurs face some cost for arbitraging to exchanges. When zeta is low, the cost is low, and arbitrageurs more or less trade until the prices are equalized. When zeta is high, there's going to be a wedge where the arbitrageurs don't totally equalize prices across exchanges because eventually their costs of moving stuff becomes too high. And so again, the quadratic structure means that the arbitrageurs also have a very similar, a very simple linear demand structure. So the amount they trade is proportional to the price gap times a constant. Do I observe any trends where traditional large equity exchanges are entering the crypto market? Crypto exchanges are expanding their offerings to include traditional asset classes. This is a good question. I think the short answer is we see these trends for stable coins, and somewhat interestingly, we see this somewhat less in crypto. I'm not entirely sure why, and I think I've heard of this happening a little more in Europe. I don't think it's happened much in the US. It's an interesting question why. I don't think it I don't think it influences our paper that much, but speculating a little bit about this, I think the regulatory questions and the tasks are different enough, perhaps, that that might be one reason why there's not that much expansion. So essentially, there's a sense in which a crypto exchange serves the roles of broker and custodian, which I think which I think are substantively different roles from kind of the pure matching role of traditional exchanges. So that might be a guess as to why this is not currently happening as much. To the extent you see competition with Coinbase, the competition doesn't come from your traditional exchanges, New York Stock Exchange or ICE. It actually comes from your traditional brokers, right? Robinhood and PayPal, right? And then sort of to some extent, these entities, to my understanding, are integrated with Coinbase, but they try and fight for top of funnel, right? So in a sense, I think like how this interacts with our paper is that customer captivity is a key thing to think about in thinking about crypto exchanges. To the extent that we see competition from TradFi entrants with crypto exchanges, it's coming through people who are fighting to keep customers captive on their platform. Robinhood, Fidelity, PayPal, and so on and so forth. So I think sort of that would be the spin on this. So I would say, yeah, but not from the exchanges, from the traditional brokers. Does that kind of answer? Was there your question? Okay. So I talked about arb demand. Now let me talk about equilibrium in this system. Suppose that the arbitrageurs have decided which exchanges to link, right? Market clearing simply implies that there are there's only two kinds of agents here, the arbitrageurs and the users, right? So essentially, the amount of corn that everyone buys in exchange I is just the sum over the amounts that all the arbitrageurs move in, right? So that's market clearing. That allows us to write the equilibrium conditions of our model, which are fairly straightforward. Consumer optimality requires consumer demand to hold. So consumers determine the price. All this says is that the price is high. The price depends on aggregate inventory. In places where you have high inventory, prices are going to be low. In places where you have low inventory, prices are going to be high, right? And aggregate inventory is just whatever was dropped on your head plus the net amount that arbitrageurs transported in. Arbitrage or optimality says that the amount that's shipped between places has to be equal to the price gap between places times this constant, right? And then so the nice thing about this model is that all these simplifications lead to an analytically extremely simple model. Notice here that what I've written is that the price is a function of the transport quantity and the inventory shocks. The transport quantity is a function of the price gap. So I do a very simple rearrangement where I move the transport quantity over to here. And then what I have is that price minus transport quantity is equal to inventory shock. And then transport quantity minus price is equal to 0. And I can write this as this nice matrix. So what does this say? This says this is a system that's basically driven by inventory shocks. And all the prices and all the final inventories are ultimately a function of the inventory shocks. So you see, this is very nice because we have a linear system and we just invert M and we can solve this for an arbitrary network, right? So the nice thing that I won't go into in detail is that this formula is exactly the formula for a physical spring system, right? So if you remember any physics, I don't really, you get a nice analogy to physics from this model. So I'll illustrate this in 2 examples. Suppose we have the simplest example, 2 nodes, right? And then we drop 2 inventory on this guy and -1 on this guy. So what happens? In the efficient world, what should happen is we should reach a state where the inventories are equalized. So this village, which has too much corn, and this village who has too little corn, this guy should sell 1.5 to this guy so that we end up with 0.5 here and then 0.5 here. Essentially, what you can think about in our model is that because arbitrage is imperfect, we move in this direction, but we don't move perfectly in this direction, right? So what happens is the equilibrium value in our example of transport quantity will be 1, slightly lower than 1.5. What this means is that some corn is moved from here to here. And then the prices move towards each other, but not totally. So the final inventory here will be slightly higher than the final inventory here. The price will be slightly lower here than the price over here. The nice thing about our model is that we can solve this with an arbitrarily complex system. So we can solve a star network example, where essentially we drop 3 and 1 inventory on these guys. We drop 2 and -1 inventory on these guys, and this has 0, right? So our model predicts a very similar thing happens here. So arbitragers kind of try to shift in the direction of moving corn from the places that have too much to the places that have too little, right? And we can solve for all the flows simply by inverting the matrix. What we find is that there's a 1.4 flow this direction, 0.4 flow this direction, 1 flow this way, and then a 0.5 flow this way. So you see the guys who have large x's, stuff flows out. The guys who have small x's, stuff flows in, right? And everything comes out just from inverting the matrix. Now, the one other thing I want to say, because this is where we want to go, is notice that there's an interesting role of this guy in this system. This guy has no inventory shock. There's very little gross trade. She starts with 0 and she ends with very close to 0. And then these guys never really buy much. However, the total amount of trade that happens through here is very large, because notice that these exchanges are all connected to each other through this exchange. And as a result, around 2 units of total trade happen here, even though the net trade that they do is only 0.1. So this is what I want to analyze in equilibrium. My claim is going to be Binance looks like this guy. Binance looks like this guy because a lot of the role of Binance is to take exchanges that have too much that want to buy Bitcoin and exchanges that want to sell Bitcoin and serve as the venue through which these exchanges trade with each other. And I'm going to emphasize the role of the central exchange basically as something as a hub or clearinghouse for the small exchanges. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show that we have a sharp characterization for when it is that arbitragers want to form such a star network equilibrium. So when the inventory costs of arbitragers are low relative to the inventory costs of consumers, there exists a star network equilibrium in which every arbitrager connects an exchange to a common central exchange. So this is an endogenous network formation model. And essentially what we want to do is the following. When does a star network equilibrium exist? A star network equilibrium exists when conditional on me expecting everyone else to form a star network. If there's one more exchange and I have to decide what to do with it, I want to just complete the star, right? And then let's think about an arbitrager in this position. What options do they have? One option is to just complete the star and then connect the last exchange to the center. But they have a few other options also. Their options are basically they can fight with another arbitrager to do the same arbitrage, right? So I didn't restrict that everyone can choose one link. It's entirely possible for two people to choose the same link. I can connect two exchanges to each other, forming a triangle. Or I can connect the isolated exchange to a already connected exchange. So in order to show that a star equilibrium exists, a star network equilibrium exists if and only if blue has higher expected utility for arbitrageurs than all the other strategies, right? So what I can show first is that this always beats this. And then this always beats this. So ultimately, I want to compare blue and green because I can show fairly easily that red and orange are dominated. However, the interesting thing that ends up happening is that green is actually not dominated by blue. And here we have an interesting trade-off that arises in our model. How do arbitrageurs make money? Arbitrageurs make money when they trade large quantities at large price differences, right? So arbitrageurs want to trade exchanges that have large price differences and also have large market depth. So their trades don't move prices much. Now, the interesting thing in equilibrium is that the center endogenously acquires very large market depth and very low price noise. Any shocks that hit this exchange are rapidly arbitraged away to all the other exchanges. And as a result, this price is going to have very little noise. Now what happens is that suppose arbitrageurs have very high inventory costs. Effectively, what happens in this regime is that the arbitrageurs are constrained mostly not by market depth, but by the size of their backpack. I can only carry a couple units of corn in my backpack. Hence, I only really care about what's the initial price gap between two exchanges. I don't care about market depth because I run out of backpack space before I can move prices. The interesting thing about this arbitrager is that this arbitrager doesn't care about market depth and only cares about the initial price gap between exchanges. And the core idea is that two peripheral exchanges have noisier price gaps than a peripheral and a central exchange. The expected price gap is actually larger if I just link two peripheral exchanges rather than linking to a central exchange. So in this small backpack regime, it becomes optimal to actually do green. The market depth advantage of the central exchange doesn't beat the fact that it has lower price noise. Only in the regime where arbitrage costs are low enough do you have the outcome that the market depth benefits of the center matter more than the price noise, and thus the arbitrager wants to link the peripheral exchange to the center. So you can think of our result as more or less saying that there's a novel trade-off between price noise and market depth in this setting where you have liquidity effects for arbitrageurs instead of consumers, right? Arbitrageurs care about both of those things. And then one of them, the market depth effect, favors centralization. The price noise effect actually doesn't favor centralization. So we think this is a new result in the literature on endogenous network formation and endogenous market structure. And we think this is a kind of interesting trade-off that could be explored further in this model. So this model has a number of implications that we're going to bring to the data. The model's implications are that there's a star structure of price correlations. If this is what's happening in the data, you should see basically all of these exchanges are linked to each other through the center. Intuitively, why is this an efficient market structure? Because this links all the exchanges using n-1 links. Whereas like if you had a complete network, you would have order n squared links, right? So this is a hard problem in general. And while we didn't prove total efficiency, it makes sense why this is a fairly reasonable way to link these exchanges together, right? In such a structure, the fact that everyone is linked through here should show up in the data through prices and arbitrage flows. Because of the fact that this guy is linked to everyone else through the center, the prices on here should be correlated with the center more than it is with any other peripheral exchange. Arbitrage flows should similarly have a star structure. So quantity should move between peripheral exchanges, not directly, but through the center, right? The other interesting set of predictions is that the star structure, our theory basically, says that exchanges are fundamentally not competing with each other. In our model, we shut down the competition entirely. Instead, what is happening is that arbitrageurs kind of help each other because they are linked through arbitrage, right? Peripheral exchanges are linked through the center. Suppose we have a coin, and then the coin is, the center decides whether or not to list the coin, right? When the central exchange doesn't list the coin, each of these exchanges is in autarky and cannot trade with anyone else. The central exchange listing allows trade to flow between all of the peripheral exchanges, right? And this is interesting because what happens in a linked network? When exchanges are in autarky, inventory shocks move prices, but cannot move quantities, right? If you have a small village that's isolated and it gets too much corn, prices decrease, but the corn has nowhere to flow, so quantity doesn't change, right? After Chicago starts trading corn, what happens is that villages that have too much corn can just sell it into Chicago, and that's moved to everywhere else. And so what that means is that Chicago listing corn should cause the dispersion of prices across all the peripheral exchanges to decrease. It should increase trade and arbitrage volumes, as basically the trade in the peripheral exchange becomes a sum of both like buyer and seller trade within this exchange and also arbitrage trade, right? And the other interesting prediction is basically the peripheral exchange should be more willing to list an asset after the central exchange lists it, right? Because if the peripheral exchange collects revenue proportional to the volume of trade, the higher the volume of trade, the higher their willingness to list, right? So these findings are obvious in our model. What they really want to reject is the competition over customer story. Notice that you have kind of the opposite predictions if exchanges are competing for customers, right? If exchanges are competing for customers, suppose you're in the yogurt market, right? If you're selling yogurt and Walmart enters and sells yogurt, what happens? Walmart steals your customers, so your volumes go down. And then because you anticipate lower profits, you're less likely to sell yogurt, right? The interesting prediction our model here makes is that crypto exchange competition is the opposite. What should happen in the data is that Binance listing a coin should increase rather than decrease volumes at peripheral exchanges. The customer ceiling effect is dominated by the arbitrage volume effect. And because of that, what should then happen is basically the peripheral exchanges should be more willing to list tokens after the central exchange lists. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in this model, the shocks to each exchange is kind of exogenously fixed by the model. But in reality, it could be the case that those shocks are like endogenous. So suppose we consider the following case. We allow the customers to choose exchange, and the larger exchanges attract more customers, so there will be liquidity begets liquidity effect, and the variance of that shocks to that larger exchange will be smaller than the smaller exchange. If you combine that with your current model, there'll be like both your effect and the competition over customers effect.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of the implications of that. I think I agree with you that to some extent, in principle, it should be possible to have partly mobile customers. It becomes kind of analytically messy, but conceptually, I think there's no reason why it can't be solved. I also agree with you. There are interesting interactions where essentially the features of exchanges, the asymmetries between exchanges are endogenous. So essentially, customers going to exchange can make it more or less attractive for arbitrages. I think especially an interesting point you point out is that if we differentiate between two classes of agents, customers and arbitragers, there's classic customer liquidity begets liquidity models. There's classic arbitrager. I mean, we wrote the arbitrager liquidity begets liquidity model. You could have a model with both kinds of agents and think about cross-type liquidity begets liquidity effects. So to the extent that that's what you're saying, I think I agree that's quite interesting. I haven't thought of the implications of that, but I think that would be a pretty interesting model to think about. Yeah. Okay. And then so essentially sort of one empirical thing that we can test is that this market structure is going to lead to exchanges looking more like complements and substitutes. And this has implications for regulation, and I think also implications for just thinking about this market structure, right? The nature of interaction between crypto exchanges is not simple oligopolistic competition. Okay. So we're running out of time, so I'm not going to talk about all the problems with my model's assumptions. My model is great, and all the assumptions are perfect. I'm joking. Okay, so then we are now going to talk about data. So then we basically have two kinds of data. We have price and volume data on exchanges. So we use cryptotick.com. This is a somewhat lesser used data provider. And a benefit of this provider is basically number one, it has a very large number of exchanges compared to other providers. And number two, it was fairly cheap at the time we bought it compared to other data providers, right? So I think it raised prices later on. But at the time we bought it, it was quite cheap, surprisingly. And then we gather on-chain arbitrage flows on Ethereum. And then so Ethereum has a lot of the tokens traded on our exchanges. We identify exchange-owned addresses. and identify the flows between exchanges through trader-specific deposit addresses. So we have 21 million arbitrage transactions involving 230 coins and 90 exchanges. So our model predicts that price correlations should have a star structure. So what should happen is basically that the prices on peripheral exchanges should be more correlated with the center than with each other. And so we're going to test that very directly simply by taking all price correlation. And then we're going to calculate all the price correlations involving peripheral exchanges. And we're going to plot that in the red line. And then we're going to take all price correlations involving peripheral and central exchanges, and we're going to plot them in the blue and green lines. And you see basically red is higher. And what that means is that exchanges tend to be more correlated with the center than with each other, right? So this is a simple test, but it verifies the feature of our model, which is that indeed price correlations have a star structure. You can think of peripheral exchange prices as central exchange prices plus some noise, right? We can also make a map of arbitrage flows. Oh yeah, and then we can do a simple test of price gap reversion. And then you would expect, and what happens in our model is that if you drop some inventory on a small exchange, what happens is that the small exchange price reverts to the big exchange price, not the other way around. In our model, in a stylized way, it's not that the central exchange is any different. What makes it different is exogenous, that it is linked to a bunch of exchanges and acquires depth because Corn put in Chicago has a lot of other places to go. So this is obviously stylized, but we kind of want to emphasize and illustrate that some of the market depth of the central exchanges is endogenous and derives from its links to other exchanges, right? And then so we test this and we find, as some others have found, that essentially sort of a small exchange, when a price gap develops between a central and a peripheral exchange, it tends to close towards the central exchange. So this moves towards this, not the other way around, as our model predicts. And then we can make a map of arbitrage flows. And of course, reality is messier than the data. The part of this plot that is relevant for our paper is that there are a fair number of exchanges that more or less have around one link to one large exchange, right? So you see a bunch of exchanges that are more or less linked to one larger exchange, either Coinbase or Binance or another large exchange, right? And so what this rejects is that the network appears far from complete in reality. In a model where there were full frictionless arbitrage between exchanges, you would expect basically that we should see arbitrage links between every pair of exchanges, right? Price gaps can emerge everywhere, and we should at some point see quantity flowing between any pair of exchanges. But this is not what we see happening in the data. What we see happening in the data is that there are some exchanges that more or less we only ever see that exchange arbitrage against Binance, right? So this is a fairly simple fact, but it does fit in with our model, which says basically in a world where there are exchanges that are only arbitrage with Binance, Binance has an important role as basically the connectivity hub through arbitrage of the entire market, Binance, Coinbase, and other large exchanges. So finally, we're going to test the predictions of our model on the strategic interactions between exchanges. So our model predicts that central exchange listings decrease price dispersion across peripheral exchanges, increase trade and arbitrage volumes, and increase peripheral listing propensity. So this is the empirically most detailed part of our paper. For time reasons, I'm going to go over this fairly quickly. What we do basically is we estimate differences in differences specifications, right? So we're going to take central exchange listings, and then we're going to regress coin time and coin exchange time level outcomes on the listing, right? So this suffers all the problems of basically endogeneity and sort of this is not a clean experiment. And the best response I have to that, of course, is we have parallel trends. It's not perfect, but it is what it is. Descriptively, after Binance and Coinbase list, so first of all, price dispersion across exchanges is quite large. In our data, the dispersion of prices can range from around sort of 5% from P75 to P25 across different peripheral exchanges. So this is very non-trivial price dispersion. And you see there's a non-trivial decline in the P75, P25 spread of prices across exchanges after the listing event, right? So we can test this in diff and diff form, and you similarly see that when central exchanges list, when Binance or Coinbase list a new token, the dispersion of prices across the smaller exchanges that listed that coin before tends to decline, supporting Binance and Coinbase's role as facilitating arbitrage across exchanges. If Binance and Coinbase were not helping arbitrage happen across exchanges, it would be puzzling to see why it is that a bunch of exchanges that could have been arbitraged against each other experienced a decline in price dispersion after Binance and Coinbase list. So this suggests that Binance and Coinbase play some role in arbitrage across exchanges. We can also directly look at the arbitrage flows. After Binance and Coinbase list, we see larger arbitrage flows across exchanges in diff and diff form, right? A large and persistent increase in how much arbitrage volume there is. This is a dummy for arbitrage volume being greater than 0 at all. Arbitrage is surprisingly infrequent, with arbitrage happening, I think, in the ballpark of 40% of days for the representative coin in our data. Binance and Coinbase listing a token makes arbitrage more frequent. Conditional on being positive, Binance and Coinbase also make the magnitude of arbitrage volume persistently larger. Binance and Coinbase listing increases trade volumes. This is more or less known in the industry literature, that there's a Binance pump effect, right? But this is consistent with our model, showing basically that when Binance and Coinbase list, trade volumes increase. And this rejects and pushes against the Walmart model, right? Binance and Coinbase's primary effect when they list a coin is not stealing your business. It's generating so much additional arbitrage flow that on net, what happens is that your trade volume increases, right? In response to this, if you knew that this is what Binance and Coinbase were doing, so this is extensive, this is intensive, what you should do is follow Binance and Coinbase, right? Exactly the opposite of the small shop when Walmart opens. And indeed, what happens is when Binance and Coinbase list coins, you see basically that other exchanges become more likely to list the coin after Binance and Coinbase lists. And that works in differences. In differences form, what this really tries to show is that revealed preference-wise, exchanges seem to think that Binance and Coinbase listing is good for their profits rather than mainly cannibalizing them. So I have around a minute left. I'm going to skip this, and then I'm going to just briefly mention that we have an analysis of spillover effects in the paper. So I'm going to conclude basically, and I'm going to skip robustness. So I'm going to conclude basically by wrapping up and sort of talking a little bit about regulatory implications. Why is crypto exchange structure so fragmented? Our argument is this derives from fundamental features of crypto as an asset class. Crypto is commodity-like in the sense that it is globally fungible. And the emergent market structure for crypto in the world becomes commodity-like in having a fragmented network of exchanges market structure. Crypto exchanges are the boundary between the fragmented fiat and regulatory systems of the world and its unified crypto rails, and the exchanges need to be fragmented because of the fact that the boundary between different fiat systems and crypto is optimally managed by a different entity, right? And then so for regulation, this kind of means that you should regulate exchanges. You should also potentially regulate the arbitrageurs that play a large and understated role in this market structure as the entities connecting the exchanges. Predictively, essentially, our argument is that to the extent that the market structure of crypto exchanges derives from a fundamental feature of crypto as an asset class, crypto exchanges may stay fragmented in the longer run. However, in parts of the world, if you think crypto starts replacing fiat entirely, to the extent you think people start actually using stablecoins in some part of the world as their main source of fiat, the fiat crypto boundary problem disappears. Large exchanges may emerge, which basically play the role of serving the entire part of the world for which crypto is the main source of, basically, is the main thing they use for what fiat used to do in the past. So this is very speculative, and we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but that summarizes what we have to say in the paper. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anthony, for the insightful and rigorous presentation. So now we have time for Q&A. So if the audience have any question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Any question?
Hi, Anthony.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I just have some quick question, but I'm not that familiar with this market, so my words might be wrong. So I guess all the exchanges, I mean, they do not enter this market simultaneously and play the game. So what I'm thinking about is that I guess this entry-exit process should be should be slow relative to the high frequency trading. So do you think that a dynamic setup might be helpful for us to explain, let me say, the exchange dynamics, or to analyze to consider the uncertainties of the prices of the crypto? And my second question is that if your DID strategy shows good evidence about the goodness of your model, do you think it can be helped? Do you think we can do some because you also have a model, so can we do some counterfactuals by introducing the regulation and say the welfare effect? And that's my question.
Thanks a lot. So this is a very good question. When we were building this model, essentially what we want to do is arbitrage is an inherently dynamic process. And then so the question is basically, do you try and write a dynamic model of arbitrage or some kind of static model, right? And so essentially to keep the paper simple, we wrote a model which is obviously stylized, but sort of simpler as a result. So notice our model is a one-shot game. And limits to arbitrage in our game is basically that inventory shocks after the one-shot problem are not perfectly arbitrage away, right? And then so you can think of this at some level as a proxy for, in reality, it's not the inventory, it's not that the price gaps are not arbitraged away. You might think of it as the arbitrage gap, the price gaps take some time to be arbitraged away, right? And essentially, I think a more realistic model would actually take that realistically and then model the convergence of price gaps over time through limits to arbitrage, which basically serve as flow costs instead of static costs, right? And so the main reason we didn't do that is because that model is much more complicated. There are benefits, of course, of doing a more complicated dynamic model. There's benefits to realism. There's benefits to, you can sort of think about the dynamics of price gaps. We don't have an explicit prediction. Like, we tested the price gap convergence, but we can't make that prediction very explicitly because we work in a static model, right? And a model like that would have the benefit that you could structurally match over time what is the convergence of price gaps in the data, right? And so to the second question, I think your first question actually answers your second question, which is that if we wrote your model, we could do realistically maybe the counterfactuals, and our model is too simple, so then it's kind of hard to do counterfactuals in our model, right? So I think sort of styles differ. Personally, my view is that this model is stylized enough that it's, I think, helpful for developing intuitions, but I'm a little hesitant to do sort of very quantitative counterfactual analysis in the context of this model because of the fact that it's more or less an applied theory model, like that's clearly unrealistic quantitatively, but makes a qualitative point. So I think sort of if one wrote, it is possible to, though potentially difficult, to write a more complicated dynamic model. And the benefit of doing so would basically be that one benefit of doing so would be you can do more realistic counterfactuals. Yeah.
All right, I see. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi,
Okay, you go first.
I have some question.
Oh, yeah.
May I ask?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Anthony. So I have 3 questions. One is related to the economics of the central exchange. I'm interested to hear your point that how does the dynamic of this central exchange versus the other exchanges, how does this emerge? For example, do we initially have a bunch of small isolated peripheral exchange, then you have some central exchange, or the other way around, you have some central exchange, other ones just a kind of reborn link to it, or and how many central exchanges would we have? Is there any logic in this? So that's one question related to exchange, central exchange. The second question is related to the coins. Does it make difference about which crypto are we talking about? is it just Bitcoin or other stuff? Does it make difference? So that's about the coin. The third is about the difference of the regulation. Presumably, different countries have a different level of the regulation stuff, control like that. So does it make your prediction different? So one is related to the central exchange dynamics. Second is related to the coins. The third is related to the difference of regulations. Thank you.
Thanks. So in our model, the way we think about what's going on is that there are a bunch of exchanges, and then let me find this slide. So exchanges just fall from the sky in our model, and the exchanges are initially unconnected, and the arbitrageurs simultaneously play a game connecting them, right? Obviously, this is unrealistic, but essentially sort of what we... Oh, sorry, go on. Yeah. So obviously, this is unrealistic. What we mean to illustrate here is essentially that in this story, the central exchange begins being identical to all other exchanges. And it only becomes large in the sense of high volume and deep because of the fact that it becomes a coordination hub. So it's kind of like the liquidity begets liquidity effects in classic literature. The coordinated exchange that everyone trades on is no fundamentally different. It acquires its difference through the coordination of agents, right? So let's talk about what this means realistically, and let's talk about, I think, sort of what it means for the model. Realistically, there's a question of how did the central exchanges become central? And sort of looking at the history, my understanding is that there has been some shuffling over time. So Binance more or less only acquired its bigness in the recent 2 or so crypto bubbles. It was a relatively minor player in older bubbles. So I think what this suggests is that in practice, again, talking a little about also the question about dynamics of market structure, it's not like this is a one-shot game. In practice, there are shifts in market structure over time. Winners can lose, sort of new entrants can become central, and so on. The dynamics are far more complicated than a simple static model, right? And I think sort of the reality is that sort of there have been shifts in market structure, and at some point, Binance and Coinbase and these newer entrants emerged and took on their role as central. I think like a question that we can ask linking this to our model is basically, if we wrote a model where the exchanges were asymmetric due to some history dependence, some entered earlier, and so on, what would ultimately determine the centrality of exchanges? And the interesting thing about our static setting is that the strategic complementarities inherent in this system mean that we cannot say for sure who becomes central. I can make this guy fundamentally a little deeper or a little bigger than other exchanges, and it doesn't need to emerge as central. Because the nature of strategic complementarities is we can persist in choosing bad equilibria. I can support equilibria where this exchange is better than everyone else, but we coordinate on this one as central, right? So I guess what I'll say is that historically, there is some shuffling, and the big exchanges emerged as big through a process of many exchanges competing, and for some reason, some exchanges winning. And what we have to say in this model is that because it's strategic complementarities, there's a lot of indeterminacy in who ends up winning. Unlike the strategic substitutes model, supply and demand, equilibria are not necessarily stable. This is a little bit of a non-answer, but strategic complementarities imply that many things can happen. In terms of coins, one relevant difference I would highlight is that coins on different blockchains, in theory, the arbitrage costs for coins on the same blockchain should be lower. If you want to figure out how to arb coins on a new chain, you need to set up infra with that chain. You need to set up custody. If you want to arb ERC20 tokens, it's the same costs regardless of what token you're arbing, right? So I think while coins and chains play a minor role comparatively in our analysis, there is an unmodeled feature, which is that coins on the same chain are easier to arbitrage than coins on different chains. And then with respect to regulatory differences, to the extent I understood your question, I think like I would highlight regulatory differences as a driver of one of the drivers of the segmentation here. If all the regulation was the same and you only had the banking issue, it would presumably be slightly easier to open exchanges in different places, right? Regulation means basically that I think it segments the market in the sense that there's basically the segment of the market that plays well with US customers. There's a segment of the market that doesn't play well with US customers. And essentially you have natural niches where basically, because part of your job as an exchange is to convince whoever is running your country to let you keep operating, this becomes a specialized task for exchanges in different countries. Was that kind of, let me know if there was anything I didn't cover. Yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to I'm trying to recommend that maybe you can have more insights and tests to play with the intuition. I guess that's my point. And from practitioner's point of view, I was just thinking that, to be honest, I'm just thinking that anybody can learn something in practice from this exercise. So it got me to think that if somebody understands this logic, how this person would play with this. If this guy wants to build some kind of central market, would this guy know that this would benefit a lot from this kind of network economics or something like that? So that's why I asked the first question.
That's a very interesting question. I think being academics, we don't think very much about useful practical things, and we've been a little focused on these things. I think it's not that there is nothing one can say about what one does in the presence of strategic complementarities. And I think one, and I just made this up 5 seconds ago, so this is definitely sort of, I just thought of it. If what is driving coordination and bigness is fundamentally strategic complementarities instead of fundamentals, effort should be focused on strategic complementarities rather than fundamentals in some sense. And what does that mean? It means that you can end up becoming central if you just get a bunch of guys to arbitrage with you, right? Because getting the first guy to deal with you makes it better for the second guy to deal with you also, right? And then a story where like if you believe that some amount of the goodness of central exchanges is because they have a lot of links, then a very practical suggestion is basically that efforts spent basically calling every other guy and making it very easy for every other guy to link to you is beneficial for becoming central. Precisely because when you call the one guy, it makes it easier to call the other guy. This is a classic story in crypto, in a sense where you like call up all the influencers and tell one guy that the other guy is buying your coin and then hope that everyone converges on the good equilibrium. But I guess like there's a sense in which a strategic complementarity story leads to policy implications that go in the line of growth hacking, of create the complementarity, get everyone coordinated on you, right? And sort of, while perhaps in some sense a slightly depressing story, I think the economics of strategic complementarities are basically the economics of supporting things like growth hacking strategies. Yeah, I think I misunderstood your question the first time, but was that kind of more what you were getting at?
Yeah, so it seems it's almost like a network effect on the
exactly.
side.
Yeah, we're precisely saying that the dynamics of arbitrage leads to network effects through of linking small to large exchanges. Yeah. Thanks. So Shan, did you have the?
Yes, I have a question about the empirical part. So I probably missed that in the identification. Maybe you have already mentioned that, but I'm curious that how do you distinguish the effect of like the attention due to listing in Binance or Coinbase from the arbitrage behavior? Because when the coin was listed in Binance or Coinbase, it does get more attention and more customers. So how do you distinguish that effect from the arbitrator's behavior?
Thanks. So that's a very important question, and we tried hard to deal with it. I think the long story short is attention is probably part of the channel. And then essentially all we can do is to argue that it's probably not the entire thing. And then there's probably other stuff going on besides attention. So if we regress some measures of attention on listing, we do see an increase. And we do see a correlation between attention and volumes, right? So this channel is, like, we have some evidence suggesting this channel is going on in the data. Listings do increase attention, and plausibly attention does increase volume, right? The things that suggest that, so what we need is to argue, so essentially this effect on trade volume plausibly has something to do with attention and is plausibly not just the arbitrage channel. What we really need to argue for our paper is that the effect is not only due to attention, right? And how do we argue this? Number one, we don't see a very clear reason why attention would explain the price dispersion effect. So there are some effects that are hard to link precise, or sort of, it's not entirely clear why attention would decrease price dispersion. If anything, if attention led to higher volatility, you might expect an increase in price dispersion. And similarly, the relationship between attention and arbitrage volumes is somewhat less clear. The fact that we see this suggests that there's some channel through which there is an arbitrage channel. And then finally, we ran an additional set of tests, which basically show that if the arbitrage channel is happening, what should happen is that some exchanges, which are more closely linked to central exchanges through arbitrage, should both see higher price correlations and also have a higher tendency to see these volume increases and see these listing following effects, right? And then so this basically provides some evidence against the pure attention hypothesis, because sort of exchanges which have a higher tendency to be impacted by arbitrage have higher effects. And then we find some evidence this is the case. Finally, we do a back of envelope in the paper showing basically that to the extent we can roughly quantify the attention channel doesn't seem able to explain a large fraction of the trade volume effect, suggesting there's some residual. So this is a very important alternative hypothesis. We cannot rule it out completely. The best we can more or less do is to argue that there seems to be some evidence for our channel the attention channel can explain, and then quantifying the attention channel, even for the trade volume effects, it doesn't seem able to explain the entirety of the effect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks. So I think I got some questions in chat, so let me get through these. Let me see. Have we looked at how central exchange listings differ between large liquid tokens and smaller, less liquid ones? Do small cap tokens see the same price convergence? Jane, did we ever do, I don't think we did that split. Jane, did you ever look at that?
Yeah, so I think we do have a small exercise that's trying to on restricting to the small
Oh,
coin.
yeah.
Yeah. And so we find similar effects for the large cap tokens and the small cap tokens.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. We looked at the volume. If we looked at we did the diff and diff splits. So I think in theory we could kind of look at the arbitrage networks as well for small versus large tokens and see whether that's different as well. So I don't think we've done that. That would be a pretty interesting thing to think about. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for like what you think the differences might be, it would be great if you could tell us the answer to that question. And then there's a question, how regulation works in real life. So crypto communities, decentralization. The star structure and existence decentralized. So these are very interesting questions. And I think I agree there's this kind of thing where in our model and in the real world, the exchanges kind of exist more or less because you need to figure out banking and you need to like talk to regulators, and there's no fundamental reason, and they kind of do the same technology, right? And then sort of there's a sense in which the CEXs are doing the same copy pasting code that the smart contracts are doing across chains, right? The same way every like chain forks Uniswap and forks like all the bugs inherent in all the lending code and all the swapping code and so on. You more or less have the same market structure here. And I kind of agree that sort of from a philosophical perspective, sort of this pushes a little against the core ethos of decentralization overall. So first of all, like these guys are custodial and they're holding all the crypto and you don't have your keys, not your money or whatever they say. And sort of second of all, even conditional on sort of a bunch of exchanges doing this, our paper says there's kind of the emergence of central exchanges. So I don't think I can say like that much about this, but I guess what I can say is I think this is a theme in decentralization where basically sort of maybe from a kind of sociological perspective, you can try to decentralize, but humanity has a tendency to centralize in various ways. And there's a sense in which I think this is the core tension of the decentralized ethos of crypto. Sort of society has a bunch of strategic complementarities and tends to centralize. And more or less the question is, how do you design systems that are decentralized enough, given that there happen to be tendencies towards centralization? So I think all I can say is like, we maybe border on this very interesting narrative, But that is about as much as I think we have to say about that narrative. Yeah. Let me know if you were talking about something totally different or if I misunderstood your question. So another question, would there be other reasons for the star structure? For example, some insider market makers in small. Oh, that's very interesting. So you're saying it's not direct flows, but it's actually hedging. So this is a very interesting argument because we look at the arbitrage flows. And obviously we saw that, and essentially like in our model, so this is very interesting. In our model, what happens is basically the nature of arbitrage is like price arbitrage, or demand flow arbitrage, right? I just made that up. But essentially what I mean is that if you look at this example, what we're saying is that like Korea wants to buy Bitcoin, America wants to sell Bitcoin, stuff is sold in America and then shipped to Korea and purchased and sold, right? And then so basically like we see this show up as arbitrage flows on the blockchain. So that's very interesting because the thing that we didn't look at is suppose that you just like collect spreads here and then you never ship anything. However, you hedge over here, right? So that would be different and our model doesn't capture it. And why that's very interesting is because if that's happening, then that leads to volume and centralization here. But we don't see it because it doesn't actually involve much arbitrage flows back and forth, right? Because you just take long positions here and then you short them here. I don't think we can see that because the only way we can link behavior across exchanges is through arbitrage flows. We don't see the same guy's account on Binance and other small exchanges. So I guess what I'm saying is that's very interesting. It's completely plausible to me that's happening. I wish we could measure it, but we don't currently have a strategy for measuring it. And it would be very interesting if it were possible. I agree with you that that is another mechanism that more or less also leads to liquidity begets liquidity. And in fact, without the necessity of actually doing the arbitrage flows. Yeah, so I don't have much to say, except I think that's probably happening, but hard to measure. Yeah.
If no questions, we are coming up on the hour and a half. So thank you again, Professor Zhang, for sharing this important work with us. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. So please stay tuned for the future events from Luohan Academy, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. And have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. So bye-bye.